Tonight we gather for a conversation about Jesse Jackson's transformative impact on American politics. CNN anchor Abby Phillip will discuss her new book, A Dream Deferred, in conversation with CNN's lead Washington anchor, Jake Tapper.
Doing a kind of almost like biographical political history felt like the right thing to do at the time, because so many of these stories, you kind of need to get them from the people who were there. And the opportunity to do that is waning. And Reverend Jackson is now 84 years old, but so many of his other aides and advisors, people who were instrumental to these campaigns, are also up there in age. A couple of them actually passed away while I was working on this book. A man named Frank Watkins, who was sort of Jesse Jackson's sort of political brain. He was one of the very first people I called about this book when I started working on it. And we were in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and unfortunately, he passed away not long after. And so there was really this feeling of a need to do that sort of journalistic project of talking to people who were there. But also, the interesting part about Jesse Jackson was that he keeps coming up in our politics. You know, when I was covering Hillary Clinton in 2016, and Bernie Sanders was going around doing these massive rallies on college campuses, and he had this populist message, and then in 2020, he did the same thing again. I would have people tell me, well, you know, you can't really understand Bernie Sanders until you understand Jesse Jackson. And I think that very fact is the reason why a book like this needed to be written, so that people know that there was something that came before. And that, as Bernie Sanders told me in the book, he picked up where Jesse Jackson left off.
And so many of the ideas we see that are taken for granted in the progressive movement, whether Democrats like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Democratic Socialists like Zohran Mamdani and Bernie Sanders, so many of them were first championed by Jesse Jackson in his 1984 and 1988 presidential runs. Yeah. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so many of the issues that we actually think of as being at the center of our political debate, whether it's this idea of universal health care, the idea of Palestinian rights, the idea of a sort of anti-war posture. We shouldn't be engaged in regime change wars overseas, but we should use those resources at home. All of those were things that Jesse Jackson was talking about in the 1980s that no one else was at the time. It was kind of business as usual for both political parties, where both parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, were sort of trying to be somewhere in this, you know, mushy middle, if you will. And Jesse Jackson was not that. He was not mushy by any stretch of the imagination in terms of how he presented these ideas to Americans. And because of that, I think he was viewed as a radical at that time. But one of the things that he did that is part of the legacy piece, it's the reason why, whether you like him or not, and I acknowledge that he is a polarizing figure for sure, but whether you like him or not, the consequential nature of his candidacy is clear. Because so many of those things, he used the leverage that he created in 1984 and 1988 to change the Democratic Party's platform, to install his aides in the party's apparatus, the leadership of the political party. Ron Brown became the DNC chair after running the convention for Jesse Jackson in 1988. And so all of those people, I could run through a list of names. They went on to be cabinet secretaries in the Clinton administration, party leaders, people like Donna Brazile, Mignon Moore. Mignon Moore was just running the DNC convention just last summer. So he created this sort of foundation of political influence that changed the party over time, so that now those things that they thought were radical in the 80s became part of the conversation in present day. And that took a degree of forethought, even when a lot of people said to him, "You're doing this out of vanity." But and trust me, there might have been some vanity involved. Nobody runs for president when there's not vanity involved. But there was also some strategic foresight that I think created the dynamics that we are experiencing now.
I think a lot of people forget, maybe not in this room, but a lot of people forget just how close he came to actually winning the Democratic nomination.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 1984, he was third runner-up. 1988, he was second runner-up. And the moment that I think for the whole country, it became very real that you could have Jesse Jackson as the Democratic nominee was in March of 1988 when he shockingly won the Michigan caucuses. He basically doubled Dukakis's vote in the Michigan caucuses. And it was this sort of earthquake of a moment in the political world, because for the first time, here's Jesse Jackson, this black man that everybody was like, he's just running to make a point. He's just running because he's a narcissist. He's just running, and he's going to divide the party. Suddenly, he had an outright delegate lead. And literally, party leaders were meeting in private, asking, what are we going to do about this? How do we stop him without alienating black voters? How do we stop him now before this becomes a real delegate fight? How do we stop him became the kind of running theme of how they addressed what he was doing. And so in that moment, it was very possible that Jesse Jackson could have been nominated in the Democratic Party. But a lot of things in the 80s obviously were very different from the way that they are now. And I think one of the main things that prevented that from happening, and this is what I was told from several of his aides, including his campaign manager at the time, was that, you know, for another candidate, that kind of event would create an enormous amount of momentum. But for Jesse Jackson, it was a moment where a lot of white voters in particular said to themselves, oh, hold on a second. Is he qualified? Does he have the experience? Are we really going to do this? And I think his opponents smartly, for their, objectives, they really drove that message in that this is a guy who's not ready. He can't do it. He can't. And voters, I think, really took that seriously, to the point where his campaign manager told me that winning Michigan was actually the worst thing that could have happened to Jesse Jackson, because it actually scared people. It made people really contemplate a Jesse Jackson presidency, and for a lot of people, they weren't willing to go there. And it's kind of, you have to think, right? A celebrity candidate, which is what he was. I mean, he was one of the most famous black people in America. You've got a celebrity candidate. You've got somebody who's never held political office before. Sound familiar? Well, now we've done it, right? But at that time, it was considered to be reckless. And I guess some people today would still consider it to be reckless, but at that time, it certainly was.
So in 2008, when I was covering the campaign of Senator Barack Obama, Jesse Jackson came up in two major ways that I still remember very well. One of them was during the South Carolina primary, when Bill Clinton said something, I think after Obama won, but whether it was after he officially won or when it became clear that Obama was going to win, Bill Clinton said something along the lines of it, and the Obama people got very offended, because it sounded like he was dismissing Obama's win because there are so many black Democrats in South Carolina it's such a big block. And Bill Clinton said something, and I will spare you my Bill Clinton impression, but he said something along the lines of, well, this isn't a surprise. I mean, Jesse Jackson won here. And that really got the Obama people mad for any number of reasons. One, they thought it was racist. Two, they thought he was kind of dismissing Obama as a Jesse Jackson, niche candidate. Yeah. And then the other thing, I know is when Jesse Jackson was caught on a hot mic during a TV interview saying something about how they were going to, and I pardon my language, but I'm merely quoting the Reverend Jackson, that they were going to cut Obama's nuts off in Chicago. I forget exactly Go ahead, correct
Yeah,
me,
well,
correct me.
oh, no, I mean, that's what he said.
Okay.
I don't know, the Chicago part, maybe less so, but he said, Obama keeps talking down to black people. You all remember this. I know you do. Obama keeps talking down to black people. I'm going to cut his nuts off or something
Okay.
like that.
I got the important
So,
part right.
Yes, but continue, because I think,
The cutting of.
yes, yes.
So, but I'm just like, what was so interesting to me was he was so present, even though Obama was running a camp. This is 20 years after Jesse Jackson.
Oh, yes.
But he was still very much a force, both in terms of his opponents trying to make him, he's just a Jesse Jackson candidate. This is not that big a deal. Bill Clinton's paraphrase, and then Jesse Jackson not thinking that Obama was doing it the right way.
You could give a whole dissertation on all the dynamics there, from the Bill Clinton centrism and how he allied with Jesse Jackson in the 90s, despite them actually having very opposite politics in terms of what wing of the Democratic Party they were in, all the way to what Bill Clinton was expressing was this idea that a black candidate is going to have a ceiling, which is the ceiling that Jesse Jackson was trying to break through, but didn't and couldn't in the 1980s. And the Democratic Party's view of black candidates was what Bill Clinton expressed, which was that, yeah, you might do well in the South where there are a lot of black voters, but you can't do it anywhere else. And I think that is an accurate reflection of what the conventional wisdom said about black candidates. But at the same time, people lump Obama and Jesse Jackson in together only because they are black. Because otherwise, politically, they are not that close together. They're not that aligned. I mean, Obama ran a centrist campaign. There were some of the themes that Jesse Jackson ran on. They were both sort of anti-war. They sort of got attention for some of those positions. But Obama knew he needed to run a centrist campaign. He did go to Iowa and win first before going to South Carolina to get, in order to convince black voters that he could do it, he had to win with white voters. Jesse Jackson actually envisioned what Joe Biden actually ended up doing, which is that you could skip over Iowa and New Hampshire and use the power of black voters and brown voters to power a campaign to the nomination. So it wasn't actually Obama that went with that path. And I do think that the Obama campaign, they had a completely different strategy around running and winning the presidency. And I think it's partly because they knew that there was, if they were perceived to be a sort of quote unquote black candidate, there would be a ceiling for sure. And so they knew that the association with someone like Jesse Jackson was not particularly helpful to them. It was not helpful to them that he had that hot mic moment on both sides, because I think it both put Jesse Jackson in the headlines, and it also spoke to actually something that was real in the black community, that they felt that Obama could lecture black people from time to time. And so I think all of that was viewed as unhelpful in what Obama was trying to do. And there's all of that is to say, it was a complicated relationship, and the political dynamics are complex, because even though Obama really wouldn't have been the nominee had Jesse Jackson not paved the way for outsiders to even get the nomination. He changed those delegate rules that changed it from winner take all to proportional allocation, so that when Hillary Clinton was winning in California and all these big states, she didn't just run the table. Obama could build a delegate lead, and eventually did. But other than that, I think they ran different kinds of campaigns. And that's, I think, where some of the resentment came from on Jackson's part. I think he felt like Obama was distancing himself from black people in some ways, while also running as a black candidate. Now, I'm not passing judgment on whether that was true or false. That's just what his view of it was. And I will say, though, that it spiraled into a kind of rift that, persisted well beyond the campaign, and only recently has kind of been mended. But on Jesse Jackson's part, there was a lot of regret about that, because I think that this is where the sort of ego and narcissism of people who run for presidents comes in. You want recognition, you want adulation, especially from the person who you think wouldn't be there if it weren't for you.
Yeah, a black community organizer from Chicago. I
Yeah.
mean, I could understand why he.
But one thing about Jesse Jackson was that he coded civil rights leader to white Americans, which was not a good thing in the 80s. In the 80s, he was associated with sort of radical black activism, and he could never escape that. People always remembered the Jesse Jackson in the 70s with the afro on Sesame Street and all of that. And that image was indelible in the minds of a lot of Americans, and it was not a good one. The thing about Obama that helped him was that he didn't code that way. He presented differently and was able to kind of manage that very tricky dance that you have to do in American politics to not be threatening to some people who don't want quote unquote radicals running for president and winning.
So, you're Abby Phillip. When did you start writing this book?
2020-ish.
2020-ish. You're Abby Phillip. You are a CNN journalist. You're respected. You're not Abby Phillip yet. You know what I'm saying.
I'll take that as a compliment.
You don't have a primetime show. You're not,
That is true.
The photo spreads haven't begun. How do you get Jesse Jackson to cooperate with your book?
Well, in a way, it was easier than maybe I thought it would be. I just called him, and I said, hey, I want to talk to you about this. Can I come to Chicago and talk to you about this book project that I'm working on? So I just called him, and he said, yeah, sure. And so I got on a plane a few weeks later, and I went to Chicago. And I actually didn't know at that time that he would grant me an interview, because it wasn't really clear what he was going to want to do. But he did. And the thing about Jesse Jackson is that not only is he a former CNNer, because he used to have a show in the 90s on CNN, but he's an obsessive news watcher. And so he was very like, I watch you every night and all this stuff. And so that helped. But I also had to tell him that this was a book. This wasn't an autobiography. This was a real journalistic book. And I explained to him, I was like, look, sir, I want this book to have your input. I want it to have your voice. But I also want you to know that I'm going to have to talk about things, all about anything that I encounter that is germane to the topic, and I'm going to have to talk to other people, and I'm going to do that independently from you and from your team. And so I had to have that conversation, and first of all, he granted me the interview. We talked for like over an hour, for as long as he could at that time, because he's battling Parkinson's disease, and so he could only really sit for a certain amount of time. And then, as he does, he just kept calling me. And I would call him. And the thing about Reverend Jackson is that, and this has been true his entire life, is that he just picks up the phone and calls you. And I would get calls at all hours of the day and night about all kinds of various things. And that's sort of how the sort of working relationship went with him. A lot of our conversations were not about the book at all. They were just things that he wanted to tell me. About current events, about how he saw politics, how he saw the world. And I tried to go to Chicago as often as I could to sit down with him, because it's a lot easier to conduct interviews with him in person than it is over the phone. And I went back to his hometown with him on a trip, which was really great, because that's where you really get the sense of how indelible that experience of growing up in Greenville, South Carolina was. And so we had as many interviews as we could, given the state of his health. And the other good news about Jesse Jackson is that he has given a lot of interviews in his life. So there's a lot out there about what he's said over the years about a lot of these topics.
And when has he read the book?
He has been listening to the audiobook, so I'm not sure how far they've gotten in playing it for him. But just as his health is deteriorating to a degree, given his age and Parkinson's, he's been listening, and so it sounds like he's been enjoying it. At least he was enjoying the early parts of the book that are about his early childhood.
Politicians, especially from an era before Gary Hart and Monkey Business, lived differently than they live today. Was that something that he would talk to you about, that he dreaded talking to you about?
We didn't get, he and I did not get into that. But it's noted in the book that not only did he have a daughter who's actually a very lovely young woman. I saw her a couple days ago when I was in LA. And she was born as a result of an affair that he had in the early 2000s, right at the end of Bill Clinton's presidency. But even throughout all the years, there were the rumors that were persistent about that. And that's one of those things that, you know, one of my very first conversations with his campaign manager from 1988, it came up in that conversation because that was something that he talked to Reverend Jackson about and said to him, if I have to deal with this, I'm out. And so it's there, it's in the book, and you can't, I mean, part of it is that there's, some of that is about how was he perceived as a person? And how do you understand how the world saw him? And you have to kind of explain that it was all of that. It was both the fact that he was a civil rights leader and an activist and had that part of his life, the fact that he was someone who loved a camera, never wanted to turn down an opportunity to speak to the public. People read that as ego and narcissism, all of that. And then also the what I would say is rumors up until the 2000s, rumors that he could be unfaithful to his wife, rumors that she had to face, his wife Jacqueline had to face in the 80s. And so by the time we got to the 2000s, I think that moment really hastened his retreat from the sort of front burner of American public life for a time. I mean, he said after that affair was revealed that he was going to take a step back. And it was probably the first time in his entire life that he ever said that. But it was a moment that marked a transition for somebody who had otherwise been a public figure for his entire adult life.
Did his family participate a lot with the book? Did you talk to Jesse Jackson Jr., et cetera?
Yes, I did, yeah. I talked to his children a lot, and so many of them were actually a part of these campaigns, so it wasn't just, I mean, it was both the perspective of what is it like to be the child of somebody who is like this, who's in the public eye, and also what are their roles in the campaign? They were there for a lot of those moments.
What surprised you the most? What did you learn about Jesse Jackson that really you didn't see coming?
You know, I think that the breadth and the depth of the things that he did in his life, the scope, I think is kind of undersold in a lot of ways, because when you realize that from his early 20s, he went from being a college student to being at Dr. King's side, getting so close to the heart of the civil rights movement that he was mere yards away from Dr. King when he was killed, to the fact that in his mid to late 30s, he was basically running one of the successor organizations that existed after King was killed, Operation Breadbasket. Then he's in the public eye for decades. He runs for president. And in the first campaign, in the 1984 campaign, he goes to Syria and he goes to Cuba. and frees dozens of prisoners of war, dozens of political prisoners in the case of Cuba, and a prisoner of war in the case of Syria. And when I think about just that resume, and that's just, we're gonna just stop in the 80s, for many other public figures, that would be enough to kind of cement them as an incredibly consequential person. And I do think that because his personality is so polarizing to many people, there's an unwillingness to actually see those facts and those events for what they are, which is that they are extraordinary. And nobody does it. I mean, I would say very few people do it, but I can't think of another man who has run for president who's gone and, in the middle of a campaign and gone to Syria and brought back an American and then kept on campaigning. And so I think that what I learned about him from a lot of people who were close to him was that he had a real ability, a skill, and a gift of being able to delve into all of these different areas and perform in them at a very high level. And on a very basic level, as somebody who's covered a lot of campaigns at this point, not as many as Jake, but enough, you do know that that is one of the prerequisites for being president, is that you actually have to be able to get briefed on economic policy, take it all in 30 minutes, and then turn it around into something, a speech or a presentation at a meeting or whatever it is. And I think he had that. It's a rare skill, and a lot of elected officials do not have it. A lot of politicians do not have it. Jerry Austin, his campaign manager, told me, the very first day that he met Jesse Jackson and had a meeting with him about the job, he was driving from Midtown down to Wall Street to give a speech in front of a bunch of Wall Street executives and was getting briefed on the way. And then he gets to the speech and gives this stem winder of a speech about economics. And Jerry Austin, who was this sort of white political operative from New York. He was Jewish and kind of skeptical, actually, of Jesse Jackson before he ended up working for him. Jerry came out of that meeting and said, I never doubted his intellect ever again, because he'd been around a lot of candidates who wouldn't be able to do that. And I think that is that's a part of him that I think doesn't really get talked about, because I think a lot of people see him just going from thing to thing and think that, it's sort of like he just wants to show up for the photo. But I think that especially in the 80s, when he was diving into farm policy and diving into economic policy and foreign policy, there was a depth there that I think is very rare for people who are trying to operate at that level.
So here's a crazy question, okay, ready? If you were given from God the power to go back in time and change one quality of Jesse Jackson so that he would actually end up becoming president, what would that quality be? Obviously not his intellect, right? You just said that
This is a crazy question.
It is a crazy question, but I tend to think that politicians who don't become president, often it's because they have one glaring fatal flaw.
Yeah, and you know what? He might have had more than one glaring fatal flaw. The truth is, he is very much a human, right? And the picture that is painted in the book is someone who has there's a lot of psychology behind him. I think that his unwillingness to build structures around his activities was a major flaw that he had. And what I mean by that is that he is kind of the guy who likes to kind of go on the fly. He set his own schedule. Reporters used to call his hotel room and ask him what they were doing the next day, because he wouldn't even tell his advisors. He would decide where they were going and what they were doing. And he was just chronically late and all of that. But he also used to say, and he said this to, I think, his Barbara Reynolds, who wrote a very important biography of him in the 70s, I'm the tree shaker, not the jelly maker. And what he meant by that was, I'm the guy who is gonna bring attention to this thing. I'm gonna shake the tree and get the fruit to fall down. But somebody else is gonna have to make the jelly. And the problem with that is that in campaigns, you have to be both the tree shaker and the jelly maker. You have to actually shake the tree, and then you also have to have the leadership ability to build a structure and a campaign underneath it that can support what you're doing. And he was always really reluctant to do that. And you know,
Why?
I think some of it is just because he was kind of addicted to the power of the microphone, which was extremely powerful for him. I mean, he came up in a tradition of Dr. King's that skillfully used the power of the press, of getting attention in order to make monumental change in this country. And I think he fundamentally believed that, and he was right to a degree, that that was his greatest skill. He was not a sort of organizational maven, right? But he was an extraordinary speaker. He was a motivator. He was a movement builder. And so there is a difference between that and what it takes to actually run a successful modern campaign. Momentum can only get you so far. You have to have momentum built on top of an organization that can help power a campaign. And this is what Obama understood very well. He had the momentum, he had the talent and the skill, but he also had a very professional, a hyper-professional organization underneath that campaign. And that is also what made him very successful. And there were also times when he, you know, there were a couple of junctures. The early 90s, when he had to decide if he was gonna run a third time, and the late 90s, when Bill Clinton was exiting the stage and he had to decide if he would run again, when people close to him came to him and said, what do you wanna do? Should we build should we build a political organization? Because Rainbow Push is an activist organization, also in a way like a religious coalition. There's an element of it that's that. But people came to him and said, do you want to build a political organization? And he declined, because I think maybe this is his own form of wisdom. I think he knows his skills and knows his strengths, and probably saw that he could be very effective doing other things. But I think that if you're gonna be a political force, and if you wanna win elections, that's the piece that he, I think he actively knew. That's not his strong suit. His strong suit was rallying people up. But politics is a bit of a different game than that.
It's so interesting. So first of all, it was a great answer. So even though the question was crazy, it was a fantastic answer. So credit to me. But no, credit to you. But here's the thing. So Obama and also Bernie Sanders, who's
Yes.
also he was I think he was, what was he, the chair of the Jackson campaign in Vermont or something like that?
Yes, and he was one of only 2 white elected officials to endorse Jesse Jackson
In
the
84.
I think this was 1988 campaign.
88, okay.
Yeah.
So, but both of them are obviously tree shakers, and both of them hired people to be jelly makers. Both of them did, and
Yeah.
there was significant infrastructure you and I both know Obama and Bernie, and they get annoyed with their jelly making apparatus because it makes them do things that they don't want to do.
Right.
Right? I mean, like Obama, I remember covering Obama in Iowa in 07, 08, and man, the campaign annoyed him because, now we're going to Dubuque.
Yeah, and that's every candidate, right? Like every candidate chafes against the constraints of a campaign. And
But they knew, Obama and Sanders,
yeah.
well, I need to have this jelly making apparatus.
Yeah. I mean, in the campaign, even when he went to Cuba, for example, there were many of his aides that were like, we shouldn't be doing this. Like, we should be campaigning. And he was like, no, I got to go to Cuba and go get these prisoners of war. And he did. He got them. And he brought them back on a plane. And so there are just some things that he was just like, I'm going to do it. And the one interesting thing to me about why, because I did think to myself about the very question that you just asked me, well, Bernie Sanders had a campaign. Why didn't that help? But it did. It did actually help. I mean, the second time Bernie ran, he was way more effective. But I'll get to the other part on Bernie in a minute about why even though he picked up where Jesse Jackson left off, there's a missing piece for him. But when it comes to what was happening with Jesse Jackson, this was the 80s. So there was no what's it called? Act Blue? Yeah, there was no Act Blue, right? So you're not taking small dollar donations and using it to power a campaign. They were literally getting change from people in Kentucky Fried Chicken buckets and then mailing it back to Chicago. And it wasn't eligible for matching federal funds. And so even though he had an enormous amount of grassroots support, it was not quite enough to actually fund and power a campaign. And so they were building the plane as they were flying it. And it was structurally very difficult to do that in that time. It's really hard to have the money keep up with the needs of an accelerating campaign as you get into Super Tuesday and all the states that come after it that are required in order to become the nominee. And so even the momentum, I think if his momentum had been matched with sort of modern day fundraising, I think it might have been a different story. But in that time, it was not. And that was problematic. From just a nuts and bolts perspective of how campaigns work. On the Bernie Sanders piece, one of the things about Senator Sanders, who I also covered in 2020 for a bit, was that he really understands the economic populism piece of the Jesse Jackson message. But he was never as fluent in the social justice piece of the Jesse Jackson message. And if you are running in the Democratic Party, you cannot have one without the other. Because the Democratic Party, as Jesse Jackson helped create it to be, is a multiracial, multi-ethnic, diverse coalition party. And if you are a candidate and you are only speaking to the one thing, and it's perceived by the many diverse voters in the Democratic coalition that you don't understand the concerns that they have around their deeply held identities, then you're going to hit a ceiling. And I think that's exactly the ceiling that Bernie Sanders hit. He tried really aggressively in 2020 to solve that problem. But the missing piece of, can you speak to voters of color? Can you appeal to all of the constituencies of the Democratic Party was always there for Bernie. And I think that was also the reason that he was never able to get past a certain point in the Democratic primary.
Yeah, he brought in Killer Mike to help. But
Yeah,
that wasn't enough.
and look, Jesse Jackson endorsed Bernie Sanders in 2020 in Michigan. So Jesse Jackson believed that Bernie Sanders had the right message. And he had a lot. Nina Turner, we know. There are people who are Bernie Sanders acolytes, but getting that message to penetrate in the actual communities was difficult for him, and he wasn't really able to do it.
I have some questions here from people in the audience. Some of them I've already asked, so I apologize, but great minds. Can you describe, because this is a really good one, this is from Estebania McIntyre. Can you describe the current relationship between Obama and Jesse Jackson? Because you alluded to it,
Yeah.
but it sounds like you know more than you told us, so tell us more.
I don't want to overstate this because, they, as far as I know, from what I've been told, they had one recent meeting, and it was probably about 3-4 years ago. And they just happened to be at the same hotel, and President Obama reached out and said, "I'm here. I'd like to see Reverend Jackson." And they sat and they talked. And it was an incredibly meaningful meeting for Reverend Jackson, because prior to that moment, they really had not spoken in, I don't know, maybe a decade. And so I would say, again, I don't want to overstate this, but I think the relationship is cordial. It's not close, but I think both men are kind of in a place where they're okay, like letting bygones be bygones, if I had to guess. Otherwise, I don't think Obama would have reached out for that meeting. And I certainly know that Reverend Jackson, I mean, like a lot of Black Americans, he's incredibly proud of Obama. I mean, I think he's deeply, deeply moved by Obama's very existence, by the fact that he became president. That is not, the famous tears in Bryant Park on election night were very real. And he, like so many other people, never thought that that moment would happen, especially after he tried to do it and failed. And then on top of that, he's standing there in an open air rally for a Black man. And when Jesse Jackson was running for president, the Secret Service would hold up sheets of bulletproof material in front of his chest as he was shaking hands with people. So he knew exactly what it's like to be in that position, and also how terrifying it is. And I do think that, I don't think you can really put in words what that means for someone of that era, to see a Black man actually become president and actually live to tell the tale.
Rob asks a question that flows right naturally from Abby Phillip for president. The title, A Dream Deferred, and Rob wants to know, do you think the election of Barack Obama is some of what the fulfillment of his deferred dream?
I do. I do think it's some of it. I do think it's some of it. Because for a moment there, what Obama did, at least on a rhetorical level, was he made a lot of Americans of different stripes believe that we could move forward together as a country together. Different backgrounds, white people, Black people, gay, lesbian, all that, right? And I think that was one piece of it. But I also think there is a part of what Reverend Jackson dreamed of that perhaps has yet to be fully realized. And I think we're still in the middle of that moment right now as a country. I've been saying recently, as I've been out talking about this book, that the country is in a moment right now where there is a pitched battle for the working class in this country. And both parties are involved in that effort right now. And the Democratic Party is finding itself in a position where over 30 years, they've lost credibility with working class voters, especially white working class voters, with poor people, all of that stuff. And that has created an opening for a figure like Donald Trump. And I do think that in these last few years, one of the reasons that Jesse Jackson endorsed Bernie Sanders was because he felt like a targeted message that resonated with working class Americans of all stripes was what was necessary in this moment. And I think that that's still true. It was he thought it was true in 2020. I think it's probably true right now. It's the reason that you still see people like AOC and Bernie, and you mentioned Zohran Mamdani, filling stadiums of people. Because there is something that's happening in this country where there's a real anti-establishment kind of energy and tenor to what's happening in the voting population. And both parties are now in this battle for who's going to speak to that. And I think that is still the place where, if you are a Democrat, the vision that Jesse Jackson had was a candidate who can do both that and also say to Americans that, this is not like, you're not sort of triangulating between Black people and white people. You know, that wasn't his vision. He was going and talking to white farmers in Missouri and in Iowa and in other parts of the country. He was going to the Deep South and talking to former segregationists because he really did believe that there was a thread that can unite Americans across all of those different identities. And that is still yet to be done, I think, in our politics today.
The white working class voters that voted for Reverend Jackson in '84 and then much more in '88, the Reagan Democrats.
Yeah.
What would he do, Jesse Jackson, that is eluding the current Democratic Party? Like, why was he able to reach them in a way that few, except for maybe Bernie Sanders, have been able to achieve?
You know, I don't know that I have a complete answer to that, but I think that he just very explicitly rejected the establishment. That's a very kind of underrated thing, but he ran in the Democratic Party, but he was running against the Democratic Party. He was running against the establishment. He was saying, essentially, the system isn't working for you. The system is rigged against people like you. And you was working class people. You know, he would say, you know, when the factory lights go out, we're all the same color in the dark. And so I think he explicitly spoke to the distrust, to the feeling that people had that they were just getting by and no one in Washington really cared. You know, in his 1984 speech at the convention, there's a part of it where he uses this striking language about, you know, bringing back steel towns that were, you know, essentially rusted out from jobs that were being shipped overseas. And there was a time when that was the Democratic Party, that was a message the Democratic Party could say with some credibility. But in the intervening time, I think there's a perception that the Democratic Party has bought into globalization in a way that has left working class Americans behind. And that's the space that Donald Trump is occupying right now. In a way, parts of that speech about how he described what life was like in these Midwestern towns was very similar to how Trump talks about it in his speeches, in his 2016 election, so that was 2017 inaugural speech. That was actually kind of dark in a way, where he talked about, you know, American carnage and all of that stuff. And so I think that there's something to be said for recognizing that a lot of Americans are sick of the status quo, speaking to that directly, and also describing their lives. And he proposed what a lot of establishment folks thought were incredibly radical policies, just like Bernie Sanders did, just like Donald Trump did. And a lot of people said, well, that can't be done. And maybe it can't be done. This is politics, right? Like, in politics, you have politicians saying things that maybe can't be done. But that doesn't mean that they don't resonate with voters. And so this is not prescriptive. I mean, I'm not suggesting that politicians need to go around and promise things that they can't fulfill. But it's just to say that from a political perspective, there's a reason that that kind of messaging and sort of dreamscaping works in politics. Because voters want to believe that you are going to break down the barriers in your way to getting them the things that they want. And when politicians present messages to them like that, sometimes they like it. And then you have all the establishment folks being like, well, that can't be done. And voters are just like, well, why? And that's what we're seeing in New York. That's what we saw with Bernie Sanders. I think that's a common theme in our politics. It keeps coming up again and again and again.
The book is fantastic, and I hope you all go and buy it. There's going to be books for sale in the back from the great independent bookstore, Politics and Prose. It is an honor to call Abby Phillip a friend and a colleague. I hope you check out her book. Thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thank you all so very much. I really appreciate it.